So you've heard me introduce Phil a couple of times. I'm just going to say, of all the HASP presenters we have, Phil has the most diverse interests. And it's remarkable to me. I'm just going to mention them again. He has presented classes on Julia Alvarez's novel, Time of the Butterflies, on the Gospel according to Mark, the art of kayaking, the culture of the Caribbean, where he lived for several years, and then most recently Shakespeare's Macbeth, the element of time in Macbeth. Anyway, I don't think we'll find many presenters who have that breadth of interest. And as he put it in his note to me, he's in this for the sake of learning.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Mm-hmm. And thank you for making it out again. And thank you for those of you who are online. And I suspect there might be some more of you than last week because of the weather. The report we got is that it was uneven this time, and some people are dealing with it more than others. Anyway, the other thing is that response via the email regarding the scheduling of our third class was that we would wait until we had this time slot again, which is the 27th now. And so that means that you have a lot of extra time for reading. Now, all that reading was optional. And I listed several things on your syllabus that would make for interesting reading for that final session. But if there's something else you want to propose that you think is appropriate or related to our discussions, that's perfectly fine. The idea is to engage your mind. Now, you have, you probably don't have in your library some of those things listed in the syllabus. So besides the books, if you are still know people who might be interested in a copy of The Princess of the Goblin, they're still back there for sale. But we also have several copies of the sequel, which is called The Princess and Curdie, up here, both new and used. And then some of the other titles, some of his other fairy tales, George MacDonald's fairy tales. Here's a freebie. These are the same pricing back over there. Whatever you can is fine. This one's a free because it's a well-worn and beat up copy of Fantastes, his George MacDonald's first fairy tale written for adults. Anyway, over here, I also brought in some copies that are not for sale, but you may want to borrow one for your reading, or at least browse, because some of you may have copies of The Princess and the Goblin that don't have much art in, or you'd like to see what some others did with it, like this. I'll have one out here. Here's one that has the original woodcuts from the 19th century version. Some of you do that. Others have more recent creative interpretations. Just remember that none of them is as important as the image that you got in your own imagination. I think that I will have occasion to point that out, that was important to MacDonald, that he wrote to trigger things in people's imagination. He wanted to activate people's imagination. So even though he did allow some artwork to be done and published with his works, his point was that he had trust and faith in your imaginative skills and beyond his control. And those were more important than anybody else's necessarily. Anything else I have to say about this? Here is the, if someone is really interested more in his life, this is considered the best biography of George MacDonald. He didn't want a biography written. He said, just my books are the only things I want to leave with the world. But people haven't been able to resist. And this is the one that's listed in your syllabus in case you do have that interest. We are going to be using the microphone a lot to begin with here. Okay, thank you, Hannah. Feel free to do that throughout or just holler at me that something needs to be clicked or whatever. To get your response to The Princess and the Goblin, your reading of it, I'd just like to use those two questions that were in the syllabus as a jumping off place. You don't have to have answers to these questions, but I'm just curious. The first one is, if you had an afternoon to explore, would you rather spend it in the nooks and crannies of the castle, the palace, or the cavernous interior of the mountain as a miner or even as a goblin? How many people would rather spend it in the castle? Okay. How many people would rather go into the mine, into the mountain? Oh, good. At least we have representation of both places. And the second question was an acknowledgement that MacDonald presents a fairly formulaic scenario in this fairy tale. There's a castle, there's a vulnerable princess, a threat to her, and there's a boy hero. Did you encounter any surprises, though, or novelties in the story as you read it? And that question I will can't be answered by hand. So if anybody has an answer to that, any surprises that you did not expect, anything that does not fit a formula, such as that. Nothing caught you off guard? Totally what you were expecting from a 19th century fairy tale. Yes, it is.
Thank you. I think, certainly this good versus evil story in there, but initially I didn't expect the princess to be as virtuous. I thought that would be Curdy, and I thought there would be some dynamic between the two of them and kind of the whole class system set up there. But so I was surprised that she was what I took as virtuous.
The virtuosity of it, and she was almost a little bit too. That's why I say that sometimes the prissiness of fairy tales, particularly 19th century fairy tales, is a stumbling block for me. But when I accept that as a common feature and part of his appreciation of little girls, he did admit that he felt he was troubled by the fact that he was not as intimate with his sons as he was with his daughters. So I don't know what that says. Psychologically, I'm not a parent. But he may have had more connection with them. Although his sons don't show any sign of being neglected. They were as full of praise for their father after his death, particularly in their writings and things like that, than as his daughters were. Yes, go ahead.
I have a comment from Susan online, who I think this is a response to your question, says, the spoiled nanny and the kindness and deep gentleness of the great grandmother.
Okay. Ludi, the nurse, does come off as a little not understanding the child, not understanding Irene. I've heard it pronounced by some folks in England as Irene. And I don't know. I never followed that up. So your guess is as good as mine. how 19th century England would pronounce, or Scotland would pronounce the name Irene. But I think it's beyond a shadow of a doubt that MacDonald knew that Irene is the Greek word for peace. So that might have played a factor. And that has three syllables, or three pronounced syllables. So that may be a clue, but you can say it however you want. But did you notice that there's a lot of care not to paint her in a blanket condemnation. The princess comes to her defense at a number of points. She doesn't want her father to be too hard on her. And when that one infraction that, where she doesn't trust her at all, and it accuses Irene of something, and they're going to set somebody else in her care, she changes her mind and say, no, she will stick with Ludi as her nurse. Also, who are the bad people? Let comment here first.
Well, I was just going to say, I was very surprised about the poetry
Oh,
in it,
mhm.
Kirby. And
Oh,
that,
yes.
and that the
Mhm.
goblins didn't like it. They were
Mhm.
frightened of it. And I thought that was an interesting.
Yes, very much that poetry is as a defense, poetry as strength, because since they cannot fathom and cannot create poetry, his singing these rhymes, kind of immobilizes them, scares them away in fact. And so that notion I found interesting too. But since you brought up the goblins, they are the evil characters in this story. But I'm wondering, did you even find some indications of a reluctance just to write them off as evil? Did you find any spaces where you think MacDonald might be wanting us to keep an open mind for the goblins? Yes. Mhm. Here's the microphone's coming right to you.
I think his main character, her trusting about everything,
Mhm.
and how she is curious about them, because nobody can tell her about them other than bad things, and she has the curiosity that said, are they bad? And I've got to find out for myself what's
Mhm.
going on here. She was spirited away from her
Mhm.
where she was even familiar.
Right. That first encounter as they're running down the mountain back to the home, and she says, "Oh, look, Ludi, look!" And Ludi will not stop to look, and will almost is denying their existence, where she is curious and she wants to see more of these. These are the Cobb's creatures, the goblins creatures, the kind of deformed, misshapen animals.
I thought the time that Curdy was breaking through one of the parts of the tunnel and discovered a whole family of goblins.
Mhm.
And they came across as a family who's being disrupted and needing to move and more humane.
Right. Okay. I even sense that in describing the history of the goblins, MacDonald is opening up a crack for us to see that maybe we created them. Maybe the human population created them by their treatment of them. They had to go into hiding. And that contributed to we'll get into a little bit more later, this idea that creatures can evolve to a higher state morally, and they can devolve. And there's a connection with their physical appearance, with that moral devolution. And now this is going to sound a little bit Freudian, and MacDonald wrote before Freud. Remember that. But there's also the sense that the goblins represent that portion of life that we've suppressed, that we've put underground. And that suppression is a negative thing. Remember, at the end of the story, he talks about how this whole catastrophe meant that not all the goblins went back down to live underneath the ground, and some started getting more friendly and reversing that process of devolution. And he says, where a lot of them were just like Scotch brownies are today. Now, I've never studied Scotch brownies. And so, but I get the impression that they were considered kind of friendly parts of the Scottish imagination, and were not as threatening as the goblins were. That opens up the possibility of seeing the whole story as internal. What happens when we suppress parts of ourselves and deny parts of ourselves? What happens to those? What can fester when we keep something underground and do not wish to understand it? A lot is made of the fact that the goblins comically misunderstand humans, but you can probably assume, maybe you can find examples of it, where the humans have misunderstood the goblins. And that misunderstanding, that lack of understanding, augments the problematic nature of the two worlds existing. What about, you mentioned the virtuosity of the princess, and that Curdy had more failings to overcome. Notice that what has happened is, in that traditional framework of a vulnerable princess and a boy hero, without becoming a feminist, I don't think that we could call MacDonald a feminist, although some have tried. Without becoming a feminist, MacDonald has reverted that. Notice that before that Curdy can accomplish any good, the princess first has to rescue him. So this is a story about a younger princess rescuing the boy hero, who would be trapped in that mine for who knows when. Maybe the miners would have found him eventually, but maybe not. Their intention was to feed him to their animals. And before that could happen, Princess, the one who's supposed to get rescued, has to rescue him. I found that the first time I read it as something surprising to find in a 19th century fairy tale. Maybe commonplace today, I don't know. Maybe not commonplace enough, but at least during the 19th century, with that. And the whole idea that if there's a character that's godlike in the story, who is it? The grandmother, or the great-grandmother, or the great-great-grandmother, or the great big huge grandmother, or the queen. She gets called a lot of things, which might be significant. That lack of consistency in referring to her may be an important part of her characterization. Anything else surprising that you may have found that does not quite fit the mold? Or
well, just listening to this, the separation, like good is all on one side and evil is all on the other side. But then the other thing I was curious about with the goblins, why are their feet the most vulnerable part?
I'm not sure I know. Does anyone? Why are their feet the most vulnerable part of their body? The fact that their heads are harder, likewise their hearts, Um, that's a little bit more understandable, but that's, anybody have any ideas? Why are the goblins' feet, their vulnerability? Mhm. Now, the ankle was Achilles' vulnerability. Um, because he was dipped, was it where in the river's Styx by his heel. So, but I don't know. Who was it wasn't Wordsworth. I thought it was one of the Irish poets who said, "Nor can foot feel being shod. The world is too much with us." I think that was Hopkins, I think. But Wordsworth has some similar statements. And remember, we talked about Wordsworth and Coleridge being a main influence on those in the Victorian era who did not want to follow lockstep with the progress of the age, which was toward more technology, toward more rationalism and stuff. They were trying to drag Wordsworth into the rest of the century, and Coleridge, who had that romantic sense of the connection to the earth being so valuable. And that may be maybe it was one of the goblin strengths, hidden strengths, is that they had more of a connection to the earth since they didn't wear shoes. But I just wrote it off to, to silliness, that the idea that toes are ugly. And so that's why we wear shoes, is to hide our ugly feet, because we have toes, stupid things like toes. I don't know. If you come up with any answers to that, feel free to jot them down or email them off. I'd be interested in hearing more. And yes.
I'm just thinking of this because unfortunately I have a friend who is, due to diabetes, has lost toes and feet. They provide stability.
Mm-hmm.
They are an anchor. If you've ever broken a toe, you realize that they're not little things, even though we kind of tend to ignore them. But they do provide a lot of stability and foundation. So that's interesting that the goblins, that's important to them.
Okay. Anything else surprising or not, but that you enjoyed about the story, that made it possible for you to stick with the 19th century language through a whole narrative like this, that kept you reading?
I have a comment here from Susan, who's watching from home, about the vulnerability of the feet. She says it would appear that the soles of the feet were not a problem, but the top side is, and even today could be damaged easily.
Ah, okay. Thank you, Susan. Right. And then there's the joke in one of Curdy's rhymes about soles and soles of the foot and the soles. So that maybe, I wanted to find something good about not wearing shoes, but I'm not sure that MacDonald was thinking in those terms. So anyway, anything else that you'd like to, first response to your reading that you would like to make? What else seemed very 19th century to you, that would separate it from, say, someone writing a fairy tale today? Although there's that tendency in a fairy tale to always go back, to the past. So I don't know too many. We call them something different if it's too contemporary. We call them a parable or something like that. But, yes.
Another comment from Susan, and forgive me because I haven't read the book, so I don't know the significance, but she's written the thread, a significant connection.
Okay, let's talk about that thread, because I don't have much imagery for you on the screen this week, but well, first let's go back to this. Let's go back to the idea of it as a metaphor. What is it a metaphor of? that thread that the queen or the grandmother gives to Irene the princess. Can you think of a metaphor? I'm not saying it's equal to something, but what is it suggestive of? What's the title of our course? Faith, Science, and Fairy Tales. Okay. Can you see that thread as a metaphor for faith? You know, something that you can't really see. This is, and if you want to refer to something in the book, we don't have the same editions. We can't use page numbers, but we do have the same chapters. So this comes about 3/4 of the way through chapter 21. And this is after the princess has found Curdie trapped in the mine and helped him get him released from the rocks. Curdie says, "Now, I think we shall be saved." The princess says, "Of course we shall. My grandmother is taking care of us." And she has already mentioned her grandmother and the thread, but he's discounted that, you know. "That's all nonsense," says Curdie. "I don't know what you mean." "Then if you don't know what I mean, what right have you to call it nonsense?" What does that suggest about the princess? She's going to stand around. Right? She hasn't come, this whole idea of the grandmother and the thread has not been easy for her to comprehend. But she's experienced enough of it that she isn't going to let Curdie talk her out of her experience at all. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Comments in the chat. Susan says relationship, and Mark says Holy Spirit with a question mark.
Ah, okay. Right. I want to continue this little encounter. Then later on, this is about 7th, 8th way through just toward the end of that chapter. Curdie comes back to the subject. "But how did you find your way to me?" "I told you already, by keeping my finger upon my grandmother's thread." "There," and she adds, guiding Curdie's hand to the thread. "You feel it yourself, don't you?" "I feel nothing at all," replied Curdie. "Then what can be the matter with your finger?" When there is a difference of understanding or perception, I think that what this passage is suggesting, that we shouldn't always discount the person who perceives something. And her immediate response is, "Okay, there's something wrong with your finger then," rather than there's something wrong with her brain, you know, or her imagination even. And then at the next chapter, this is after the attack has happened. And they're back at Curdie's home, and where the princess has found her thread again, has led her to safety by leading her to Curdie's mother in their cottage. And Curdie is complaining because he knew that the attack was coming, and he tried to warn the guards, and they wouldn't believe him. You know, they wouldn't believe that they had dug this hole, etc., this passageway into the castle. "They ought to have listened to me, and then they wouldn't have been taken by surprise as they were." That is true, Curdie, but it is not for you to blame them too much. You remember? Because Curdie had complained to his mother, that the princess was talking nonsense. Before I forget, we'll go back to the whole nature of the string, the thread itself. What I find in that is a suspect's suspicion that faulty judgment based on insufficient perspective is more easily detected in another person's thinking than in our own. So we, just like Curdy, are probably do the same thing with other people. We feel it when we are unfairly being not being perceived or not being listened to, or being discredited. But it's something that happens all the time, and we probably do the same thing to other people. But there's something else I want to point out, is that a faulty judgment, such as Curdy was making of the princess, or the guards were making of Curdy, for MacDonald does not equal doubt. Notice that whenever the princess doubts the presence of the grandmother, whenever Curdy doubts the presence of the grandmother, they are not being chastised. The grandmother always forgives the princess and understands. And the grandmother encourages the princess to forgive Ludi and Curdy and understand that some things with some people take time. So that doubting is not the enemy. That was a topic in the 19th century because of the scientific discoveries. And I don't know, let's see.
I was just going to say the other piece, though, as I recall from our conversation last week, that one of the differences here is nobody could see grandmother, nobody could see or feel the thread, whereas Curdy could see what the goblins were doing. And that
Right.
was reminiscent of the conversation last week of what science was
Mhm.
detecting with the visible eye versus faith.
Mhm. We'll complicate that a little bit more, I think, but yeah, that's good observation. That the empirical world and the spiritual world are running into conflict as well as interlocking. We can't just separate the two. We can't completely separate faith or science. Purdy's leg gets healed in a dream by the grandmother, but in the empirical world, it's observed as having happened. Not just by Curdy's own eyes, but by his mother's own eyes. So there is that intermingling. I should have written down the quote. I can find it here easily about doubt. I should have made you a slide for this because this is the, I can't put my finger on it, but MacDonald once said that doubt is the hammer that breaks through the cloud of illusion and lets in the light of pure wisdom, or something to that effect. So doubt is not the enemy. Doubt is a tool. Just like Curdy's pickaxe, it becomes a tool. Doubt is a tool that can lead us to faith. Doubt is not punished. Unresponsiveness is a detriment. Not following the light that you do have is seen as let's go back to that string. You notice, when can you feel it and when can you not feel it? When can't the princess feel it? There are times when she can feel the string, but in the very same incident, she cannot feel the string at times. When is that? Right. Oh, I'm sorry. What hinders her from feeling?
When she wants to go her own way.
When she wants to go another way,
She
or when she
thinks it-
wants to go backward. just, I will just take it back when she comes to the pile of rocks that's hiding Curdy, and she's crying. And she says, well, at least I can get out. And she finds she can't, because she can't follow the string out. Or the thread. And so it's only when we act in faith and when we step toward the direction that we're being led, it's only in that process of going forward that we can feel that faith, that the presence of that thread does us any good. And that is, you may remember that was one of the responses to the scientific discoveries and the higher criticism of the biblical records, that took place in the 19th century. There were people, portions of the church, the broad church movement, that turned their focus away from doctrines to action. They got involved in working toward alleviating some of the problems of the Industrial Revolution that was taking place, meeting the needs of workers whose livelihood, their status of life was diminishing. So that was in, let's see if I can find it here. Oh, here we go. Here's a quote that I managed to write up on there. Instead of asking yourself whether you believe or not, ask yourself whether you have this day done one thing because he said do it. So MacDonald really fit that mode, that belief was not a matter of intellectual assent to this or that. It was a matter of obeying the convictions that you get from your faith. When you step out in faith, that's when you. Okay, so let's look at this thread a little bit more. We've talked about that. It can only be felt when following, and it's not always there. It's not always there, and it's not there for everybody. Curdy later finds it on his own time, at a later time, but he cannot, and that's, I guess that means it's unpredictable. I guess that's what I meant, that it's not a tool in the same way that a pickaxe is. It's not something that we have control of. There's a mystery to it yet. The other thing that the thread resonates with is MacDonald's belief in becoming, human becoming. There's somebody calls it something else, and I could not find that reference, but there is another name that people use in referring to his theology that comes out in a lot of his sermons, and that's it, kind of a response to the science of the age. Rather than denouncing evolution, MacDonald was one of those, not the only one of those, who saw the spiritual significance of evolution, and that human beings have that capacity of improvement, of getting better, of becoming a truer soul. This was at the same time that others who were placing their faith all of their faith in science saw it as a very, very optimistic time. Everything's getting better. The human technologies that were being developed. If you heard of the Crystal Palace outside of London, that was a kind of a monument to all of this glorious science, was enabling us to do all these things. Of course, they didn't empower the majority of the people, but for those who wanted to find a glorious future ahead, They saw this is the golden age and things are going to get better and better and better because of technology. Well, we can evaluate that historically too. But whereas a large segment of the population was putting their optimism in technology, the telegraph and the railway and all of that, and how that was making us better. MacDonald's doctrine of human becoming had to do more with the soul. So there's a possibility of the soul getting better, rather than placing that emphasis on technology. And particularly in the sequel to this and some of his other writings, we can see that for him, evolution worked two ways. There was also a devolution. So the soul could deteriorate as well in other circumstances when not fed, people could get worse. And he depicts it in a physical as well as moral state, as a physical state as well as a moral state. And you see in The Princess and Curdie, people in that process physically. Of course, this is all for the sake of narrative. This is he wasn't following scientific guidelines for the rate of change that natural selection makes in the world, the natural world that we see it. Things happen more rapidly, but the people's form, physical form, could reveal the state, their moral state, as they devolved. We have another comment, I think. Good.
Yes, Susan remarks that another concern is the use of the qualifier better when you're talking about the Victorian age. Better at what and in what way and in what time?
Right. And of course, it's easier for us to evaluate that. I don't want to be too hard on those who got so optimistic about how technology was going to, be the answer to everything. That things can only get better from here on, because that, I can see myself thinking some of those things too. Let's see, what else can we talk about? Anything else more about the thread? Notice how we are prepared for that thread, that sometimes visible, sometimes invisible. The princess sometimes sees it in a certain light. There's that one time, I think it's when she goes to into the mountain. And the fact that it takes her into the mountain is pretty amazing. She thought it was always going to take her to her grandmother. But notice it leads her not to the safety of her grandmother's room, it leads her right into the place of highest danger. The goblins are after her. We know that already by that point. And yet her following faithfully leads her right into the danger, right into the place of most hazard for her. But she sometimes sees it, and she sometimes doesn't. She sometimes is only dependent upon the feel of the thread. But that whole presence, her grandmother's gift to her, is kind of prepared for by Curdie's empirical thread, his string. Did I show that slide up? Let's see. Yeah, I decided that since science now has string theory, which I try, but I can't say I understand. So MacDonald had his thread theory, and we already covered that. But that's kind of prepared for by Curdie's empirical string, his actual physical, that he could see, his mother could see, the goblins could see, anybody could see if they wanted to, if they were if they were there physically, that he uses by tying one end to his pickaxe and then stringing along as he goes into the mine, because he won't always have any source of light. And so he needs to find his way back. So Curdy really has a basis for understanding the princess's thread, even though he can't see it and doesn't believe it. It is a spiritual representation of something physical that he does understand. Any other comments about the thread?
I don't think we're on the subject of the thread right now, but Susan says Bettelheim has much to say and useful to understanding the wisdom of the fairy tale in terms of stretching the imagination for positive behavior development in children, but also subconscious development in adults related to parenting.
Okay. Plug for one of the books on your reading list. I can no longer find my copy. I'm still looking for of Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment. But that would be very helpful in understanding some of these images and some of MacDonald's venture into this world, the fairy world. Remember, he considered himself, if somebody wanted to know who he felt he was, what was his role in life, he imagined himself as a pilgrimage guide, like Virgil was a guide for Dante and to the Inferno and the other realms. He wanted to be a pilgrim guide for people into the fairy world. So anyway.
Yeah, I think following the thread into the mountain seems could be a metaphor for confronting our own
Oh, yes.
the evil or the not good things about ourselves.
The height it intensifies her trust and faith that she will follow that thread right into the mountain. And whereas the normal human pattern is to flee the opposite direction, keep it buried, to keep it buried. But maybe we need to face our demons. Okay. There is something that I'm not sure, this is the slide from last week. We talked about fairy tale and myth and how we said that we were going to use the earlier definition of myth as something that is true, that reveals some kind of truth, a foundational or explanatory narrative that conveys the beliefs of a culture, rather than just as a synonym for something that is false. And we noted that one of the differences between the two, between myth and fairy tale, is that a myth is generally considered to be anonymously authored. By that, we mean something that was something evolved. In other words, there may have been an author somewhere, the first storyteller to tell it, but it lived in the community that created it for a long period of time. And so it's no longer attributable to one particular person. And that could be a refining thing. Whereas most of our fairy tales, not all, some folk tales and fairy tales are the same way. They come to us having already gone through a lot of changes and have been refined, might be a good way of saying it, by a lot of telling. But most of our fairy tales can be attributed to the same author. There's another difference that I don't think that I mentioned, and that is that myth you'll find it defined variously. There's no one common accepted definition of myth. And some people require a myth to be about deities, about gods. If it's just about heroes, human heroes, then it's a legend. And so that is a very specific definition that you will find of myth. However, other people define it more broadly, so that legend and even fairy tale and folk tales come under the auspices of the word myth. Just to prepare you if you're reading that. I want to make a distinction, though, between fairy tale and allegory. And this again simplifies both. I'm not an expert on allegory, and I don't love allegory as much as like fairy tale, and that's a bias. And I have friends, a retired English professor from the college being one of them, who will tell me I'm not treating it quite fairly enough. But generally, allegory is understood as a tale, a story that has a direct identification of one element in the story to another element in real life. So that in the story, X represents, no, in real life, X is being represented by pound sign or whatever. I didn't want to put numbers or anything, but is represented by something else in the story. And Y is represented by this. So you have a retelling of something that exists in the real world there on the left, with a different term. You can put little equation signs. This equals that. Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory. I could read you other examples of Victorian, allegories where it's very clear that this is standing for this. This in the story is standing for this in the real world. And most people would say that the sign of a good fairy tale is that it's not so easily explained. That there might be elements of allegory in a fairy tale, but you can't rest on equations. And then I was trying to think of some diagrams I could use to represent what we're looking at when we're looking at a fairy tale like The Princess and the Goblin. If we let the borders of the screen represent the borders of our world, which we would describe as our empirical world, basically. And then there are things within our world that are not empirical, such as a fairy tale. And so we'll draw that within our world, but it has borders, okay? There are things that exist within that story and in with that story alone. And in The Princess and the Goblin, we have these three basic elements. There are humans, there are goblins, and then there's this more mystical grandmother or huge queen or whatever. Now we, in our world, can relate to one of those empirically. We can relate to humans, okay? We know and understand humans, even though these are from a different era, and we in our world don't have kings, and then most of us don't have nannies or nurses. We don't have guards. We don't have castles, but we understand them. They have existed in our world before. We can relate to them on a one-to-one kind of basis. We don't have goblins. So for us, the goblins in this story are something that we can't find in our own world. We can't relate to them in the same way. And nor do we have grandmothers that are sometimes in their 20s and sometimes in their silver-haired old age, who are sometimes there and sometimes not, and who work on spinning wheels that thread spider webs from distant places. We can't relate to that in the same way. However, the goblins exist in the same world as the humans. Not everybody, there is a separation between the two. Not everybody has contact with the goblins, and some don't have any pact with the goblins. And so there's something different about the goblins. And there is a separation between you. Let them stay where they are and we'll stay where we are, you know. Likewise, the goblins are, but they do exist in the same world. Goblins can steal sheep or goats when they want to. And mischievous boys can steal a goblin queen's granite shoe, you know, and take it into his world where it exists for anyone to see. So they live in the same world. And the grandmother is in the story as somewhat different. Not everybody can see her, at least at the same time. The princess can take Curdy up to one of her rooms in the upper reaches of her house and sit in her lap while Curdy sees nothing. Okay? So there's a different relationship between anyone in the story, goblins or humans, with the grandmother. And yet they're all part in that story. Now, we also have to talk about dreams, because dreams exist both in our world and in their world. And I have chosen not to put dreams, we could put dreams as a circle in our world and treat them like a story, okay? Because they do exist in our world and yet they're not empirical. We don't quite understand them, but there's something that goes on, that in our brain, which is a physical thing in our world, a part of our, but we don't quite, you know, understand them. Dreams exist in the fairy tale world too. Both Curdy and the princess dream. I assume she may not admit it, but Ludi probably also dreams too. But I did not represent that in the story as a separate circle, because I don't think that's the way MacDonald understands it. Remember his quote that we started with last week: a dream may be full of truth and a fact a mere shred for the winds of the limbo of vanities. Instead, I don't know if I have this represented. No. Instead, rather than putting dreams as a sphere in this world, I suggest that MacDonald is writing on the understanding that dreams are a way we can relate to everything else in our world. So dreams are a way of connecting with either the goblins or the grandmother or the creatures or the trees, the gardens, our own relatives, our own histories, tales of far off places. Dreams are a way of knowing the rest of what's in our circle. Rather than the separate element of our world, our dreams are our connection to other things in our world. And so dreams are acting in much the same way as a fairy tale does for MacDonald. He would say that fairy tale is one way that we have to understanding our real world. Our dreams are a capacity that we have related to our imagination. Remember, the Romantics believed that we weren't sponges, but we have faculties like our imagination that are active perceivers of our world. And so that's one way that he can place dreams at such a high level, that they may at times be more important than some facts. And again, don't think of alternative facts here. I said it's important to understand that we live in a strange world right now. And for MacDonald, I think he would agree with me that alternative facts are just lies. Because a dream isn't meant to contradict real facts. A dream is meant to also help maybe see those facts in a different light, see the world in a different light. There's no place in fairy tales or anywhere for lies. Yeah, go ahead. And No, that he's coming to fix it. There we go.
In the state of the dream world of sleep,
Mhm.
is there anyone who hasn't woken from a dream and wanted to get back into it to find out what happened?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes. I was so into that that I didn't want to stop.
You know, one of my greatest curiosities are, maybe someone can help me with this, and this class will prove it effective and in ways I didn't expect. I've always wondered when you dream something that, oh, I've dreamt this before. It's familiar. I've dreamt this before. I want to know, did I really dream it before? Or does my dream have a manufactured sense of familiarity that's suggesting to me that I dreamed it before? I don't know how to test that unless I write down all of my dreams. But that might be altering my perception too if I write down everything. So I don't know. Yeah, your point stands, you know, and I think that our dreams are a real part of our world, and yet there's a mystery to them. Freud did not completely understand dreams either. And I think that a lot of people have shown that he was mistaken in some of his understanding, but thank goodness for Freud, you know, coming along and lifting up dreams as something that we should be paying attention to. A lot of what he said was right, you know. And in a sense, this fairy tale leaves us to consider a place, a role for dreams. Notice that I don't know if I have this either. Tolkien, I think it was, who said that a dream should never be relied upon as the entrance to the fairy world. In other words, you should not be able to explain, oh, it was just a dream. We can't in The Princess and the Goblin, because sometimes the grandmother is encountered through a dream, either the princess's dream or Curdy's dream when he is on the bed with his injury, you know, locked up in that room. And yet the grandmother is also experienced by Irene in the real world. She first comes across her in a very in her wanderings one afternoon. She later wonders whether she may be dreaming, but there's no proof that that's a dream. There are other times when, and the sequel will present that where Curdy takes more of a center stage. And his experience with the grandmother makes it very clear that you can't just refine the grandma. You just can't keep her in a dream. That does not hold it. So there have been other writers, and I've read some of them who really like this idea of showing that maybe the fairy world can exist. Maybe it does affect, you know, and so they write stories where real life characters have experiences in the fairy world that are part of their real world, you know, and raise these questions. I find those fun, you know, imagine, but I don't think MacDonald gets us to do that. He doesn't want us to wonder if the elements of his story really exist in some empirical way in our world. I think he would rather have us see the fairy tale world as a way of looking at our own world, not in an allegory fashion, but just triggering our thoughts. The story I don't know why you have this slide, but I'm going to go on from here. There was a common idea expressed in the 19th century, in English writing at least. It got picked up and probably advanced among the German writers, and maybe the source came from them. I don't know for sure. But people talk in relating the spiritual world to the empirical world, and relating what we used to read as fact in the Bible, and now we read as myth or parable or as legend or something else. There was a common perception of talking about a story as something that surrounded a truth. And so you can't just ditch the stories, but you need to peel them apart like an onion, or a nut, I suppose, or whatever, to find the kernel of truth inside. And that was the real valuable thing. So you shed the superficial, the story as superficial, to find the truth that it holds. And MacDonald would have rebelled against that. He does, and others as well. But nobody, I think, is emphatically as MacDonald, and insisting that the whole story itself was true. The truth does not lie in something not related to the story that you can find by digging away the story and discarding the story. The truth exists through the story, through and through. It was an organic whole. Okay. That's how he would see The Princess and the Goblin, as something whole and complete, and you cannot narrow it down to a truth that you can divorce from the elements of the story itself. It's an organic whole. And he saw this as as compatible with who we are as humans. We are integral wholes as well. So must our stories be. You can't divide us up into our empirical self and then our true self hidden within. Here's something that he wrote that leads me to see a connection between what he believes about a story being an integral whole and the human person being an integral whole. He wrote, "To teach your intellect what has to be learned by your whole being, what cannot be understood without the whole being, what it would do you no good to understand, save you understood in your whole being. If this be the province of any, it is not mine. Let the dead bury their dead, and the dead teach their dead." So that's him preaching, by the way. And see, at first I thought that that's what Matthew Arnold was doing. Matthew Arnold may have been interested in that, shutting that story of the shell of the story to get to the kernel of the truth. But I'm not yet convinced yet. I know that biblical scholars later picked up on him when they developed this method of demythologizing. In other words, there was a school of the higher criticism that was now that the Bible is now undergoing. By higher criticism, I don't mean attack. I mean attempt to understand and evaluate. But a lot of people saw the parables and the myths and other things in the scriptures as being stories surrounding a kernel, and we need to shed the shell in order to find the kernel. People like MacDonald would say, no, you can't do that. That in the story of the prodigal son, et cetera, it exists as a whole. And if there's any truth in that story, it's in the story itself. And you can't narrow it down to a principle. What haven't we covered yet? I want to go back to, let me find a blank screen here. Here. I know where you're going to go, right here. Okay. Since most of you, understandably so, would rather spend your afternoon in the castle exploring, rather than in within the mountain, the caverns of the mountain. Let's look at again at the castle in terms of Freud, who remembered not right yet. He was not around yet. But did you find anything Freudian about that castle and the Princess and the Goblin? That's something that I think that Freud would have really called our attention to, that perhaps MacDonald is using the castle to represent our human mind, and that it contains unexplored regions, that things may exist within our mind that we're in areas we have not yet ventured. To me, I find that pretty amazing. And if you read more of MacDonald's fairy tales, you'll see him coming back to that, off the symbol of the house or the castle, as representative of our internal selves. Anybody here study Freud? I've tried to read him, but I've not gotten very far. What can you see any Freudian significances in this story? Anything that you feel you could share? I think that might help me understand a little bit more.
Well, I guess thinking about the locked rooms and the various parts of the castle, you know, certainly can represent a lot of the unconscious things that we don't bring to the surface or can't bring to the surface very easily.
And a fairy tale might help us to do it. The light in the tower, I think, is also very significant. It's not just that the grandmother is there, but that she can be seen around, and she can reveal herself through that. I would, as much as I would say I would want to explore the mountain, I'd love to rest in that bathtub up in that room with the stars represent up there. You almost felt like you had the sea below you as well as above you. There's something that really resonates with, the Genesis story, and reading that. And I would love to spend time in that bathtub. Yes, go ahead.
Aren't the caverns in the mountain Freudian too? There are parts of ourselves that we don't want to explore,
Yeah.
fearful.
And notice where the danger comes through. The danger of the goblins comes from underneath and up through the cellar, where we don't venture as often, where we keep things to store but not to live down there. And that's where the danger and the flood. I don't know if I understand completely that flood at the end of the story, that the goblins' plan works against them. Their effort to do destruction or spite, really, kind of. Although you could say the miners were a threat to their world, So they're really defending themselves. But anyway, their effort at destruction works against them. And it, for healing to happen, that whole interior of the mountain has got to be flushed out through the castle. Comes washing out,
Well, yeah, and it kind of gives them an opportunity for a new slate. Some of them,
Yeah.
like you said, don't die.
right.
They're cleansed. They almost take a different form.
Mhm.
But I think one of the things I was struggling with that you just said about talking about the kernel of truth and relative to humans, and we can't divide our whole self, but relating this to Freud, isn't that exactly what we do? And
Yeah.
isn't that what he suggested we do? We divide different parts of ourselves, suppress them, and therefore we're not an integrated whole.
Right. But there is something, we can't all live in a castle. But there is something nice about having so many chambers. Of course, the simple cottage is lifted up as well. But I found it amazing that even the grandmother has different rooms. There's room for her spinning, a room for her sleeping. I think the bathtub isn't the same, but I think there may be 3 rooms that she occupies up there, so that it's nothing is ever quite simple. There are if you think you have experienced the grandmother, but only one of her rooms, you haven't experienced the complete. Yes.
I have another comment from Susan. I think this is relating back to when you were talking about Freud and if anybody could help you understand it. But she says she recommends Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung as a more efficient introduction to dreams, archetypes, symbols, and signs.
Yes. I'm glad that, Susan, I'm glad you brought up Jung, because that's one of the things that I think when we look at the broader questions at hand in this relationship between faith and science. Remember, I said define faith more broadly than one particular faith, but define it more broadly than just religion versus atheism, because there are other things in our world that, or in our human experience, that we can't prove empirically. And I may be mistaken because I've not studied Jung I've tried to, but I've not come to a good understanding of Jung. But I think his idea of the collective unconscious is intriguing, and yet how do you prove that? So when we want to look at the relationship between faith and science today, we'll get into this more next session at the end. We've got to look at more than just the narrow definition of faith, and Jung's collective unconscious is something that helps not only understand the presence of this fairy tale, but also helps understand maybe the creation or nurture of fairy tale. Yeah.
One more from Susan. She says, recall Yeshua said, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you."
Oh, there's one other quote that I don't think got into my final version here. Let me try to find it here. Okay. We said that unpredictably. I mean, we did not expect in the things that were growing, expanding in the 19th century into the Victorian era, the romanticism declining, imagination declining, and that kind of thing, and rationalism and reason and science and the empirical world was on an upswing as we moved into the Victorian era. Remember, we said we would not naturally expect to find fairy tale in popular things in Victorian England, but rather as something that had died out with Romanticism. And yet the Victorian era was an era of much fantasy writing, many fairy tales were. It was, however, a controversial subject. People were trying to understand it, and they were criticizing some use of fairy tale as being too didactic, and not just didactic in the way that MacDonald is seen as often didactic. I think Princes and Curdie is a little more so than Princes and Goblin, but in a way, a very manipulative way. We're going to take this fairy tale and we are going to teach our children morals, you know. And so some of the traditional fairy tales got changed, you know, so there's a lot of reaction against that. So as I tried to read more about the understanding of fairy tale in Victorian England, I found a lot of diverse opinions. Charles Dickens, as well as John Ruskin, came to the defense of fairy tales very emphatically, but they had a slightly different understanding of it than MacDonald did. And if they're correct, some people are telling me that what stands out in MacDonald's use of fairy tale is a trust in the reader, regardless of age. The imagination was the important thing, and the fairy tale called for everybody's imagination. And so the reader's response was significant to him. And he said, the truer a piece of art is, the more meaning it will have. You won't be able to narrow it down to one meaning. Otherwise, it's not a very good artwork. So the meaning that different individuals find in it shows that it's success, that it's meant, the fairy tale is meant to trigger things in somebody's. He trusted the imagination even of children, whereas other people use fairy tales in a guarded way. Well, you can't let them have that, or you can't let them hear about this. Bruno Bettelheim brings this up too, that children know how to deal with a fairy tale. This is his response to somebody worrying about, you know, how children will handle the meaning, where they will understand it or not, or will they get the wrong impression. He said, in response to their questions, but indeed your children are not likely to trouble you about meaning. They find what they are capable of finding, and more would be too much. For my part, I do not write for children, but for the childlike, whether 5, 55, or 75. I think that's important to know, that we are not regressing into childish literature by what we're doing in this class. And I want to use that as an entryway to the next time we gather, which will be in 2 weeks' time. Again, if you want to explore some of the books on the list here, or just look at pictures or whatever, you can. I think that Reader's World has some of these stories by MacDonald that, and if you want to buy, there's at the back of the North Wind, if you're interested in death, a lot of people consider this MacDonald's classic at the back of the North Wind. And there's even a copy, at least one of this you can buy. So feel free to linger and ask further questions. Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering, is he a much different writer than earlier like Aesop's fables? Are those considered fairy tales as well?
I've never, I think that they would come into the same general, they're not the same, but then that broader definition of myth. And I would put value on them since they don't I don't think that they're attributed to one author, even though they bear the name of Aesop. I think that they've undergone that refining process. But I've never done a comparative study of that.
Yeah.
I find it interesting to compare MacDonald with his good friend Lewis Carroll, because apparently there was some crossbreeding between the two in their fairy tales, but they are very much different. So if you're a fan of Lewis Carroll, consider that, maybe bring a little report on that. But Lewis Carroll was much more quirky. You don't find that same sense of quirkiness in MacDonald. Any other questions that you feel are for the good of the order before we dismiss? Again, you can raise questions with each other or me afterwards, and feel free to linger over some of these books, or buy another one to take to somebody else, whatever. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the 27th.